Good afternoon, and welcome to the German Federation of Industry, the BDI, this sunny afternoon in Berlin for our discussion on the EU climate targets and the contribution of the building sector, as well as the need for an effective renovation wave. We have a very exciting panel, I think, to discuss these issues today. But before we get to that, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping issues. Most importantly, to you, the audience, if you would like to ask questions, you will have the possibility to do so either via YouTube or the LinkedIn channel that you are now tuned into. I would also like to let you know that Christine Hamann from the German Interior Ministry will unfortunately not be with us today, but we have a very good replacement for her, whom I will introduce to you very shortly. I would also like to let you know that if you prefer to ask questions in German, you should be, you're welcome to do so. We will translate those for our audience. And one final note, you can also comment on the event here today on Twitter or on other social media under the hashtag RenovationWave. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce our guests, starting with Pernille Weiss, whom many of you know, no doubt. Pernille is a member of the European Parliament, where she represents Denmark. She's a member of the Conservative People's Party in Denmark, which she joined at the age of 15, which shows that she's a true believer. She's also an entrepreneur herself. She founded a consultancy, which she is still the CEO of, which is called Archimed. We also have with us from Denmark, we have a heavy Danish contingent today, Hans van Steen. Mr. van Steen is, of course, representing the European Commission, where he is the acting director on renewables, research, and innovation, energy efficiency at the DG for Energy. Mr. van Steen started his career at the Danish Ministry of Education. He was later seconded to the European Commission in 1989. So he is certainly somebody who knows his way around Brussels and these issues. He started working mainly in the area of energy technology way back in the late 1980s. He became acting director on the 1st of October in 19, that would be quite a long time ago, of 2018, excuse me. We also have with us from the German Ministry of the Interior, which is also responsible for the building sector here in Germany, Lothar Fein-Krestas. Mr. Fein-Krestas is perhaps the most suited to discuss some of these issues that we're going to be discussing today because he is a trained carpenter. He did an apprentice in carpentry, which, as you know, is a great tradition here in Germany. He went on to study architecture, both in Stuttgart at the University of Stuttgart and in the United States at the University of Georgia. He has been the Deputy Director-General for Building, Construction, and Industry at the Ministry of Interior since 2016. And finally, to my right, I'm very pleased to introduce Holger Lösch. Mr. Lösch is the Deputy Director-General of the Executive Board here at the BDI, the Federation of German Industry. Mr. Lösch, like myself, is a journalist. I say once a journalist, always a journalist. He started out with the Bayerischer Rundfunk, which is the Bavarian public broadcaster, and later went on to start a career in the business world, becoming in 2008 the head of communications and marketing here at the BDI. He has been the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the BDI since 2017. So with no further ado, I would like to let Mr. Lösch kick things off with a brief statement, and then we will go to the keynote from Mr. van Steen. Mr. Lösch.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for joining us today to talk about a very central issue of the European Green Deal. Well, as we all know, climate neutrality by 2050 has been made the new and, of course, very ambitious target, long-term target of the EU, of the European Union. And as German industries and European industries, we, of course, support this political goal as well. We know that it will become extremely difficult to meet the expectations of the political targets. We as BDI have been doing a very comprehensive study 3 years ago on climate passes, e.g. on the possible and most efficient ways to reach political climate targets. And therefore we know how difficult and how ambitious all these passes are going to be in the future. And the building sector was one of the sectors we had been looking into very deep. I mean, if we look at the building sector, it's responsible for 36% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the EU and 40% of the total energy consumption in the EU. And on the other hand, the renovation rate in Europe is between, depending of course on the different member states, is ranging between a depressing 0.4% and 1.2%. That's much too low. Of course, we all know this has to change. Well, these figures, I've been telling you, 36, 40, and 1.4 to 0.4 to 1.2 express an urgent need to get going on this sector. However, there's not much time to fundamentally change these figures. The EU Commission says that the building sector should already by 2030 reduce its carbon emissions by 60% compared to 2015. That's a lot. And of course, we see there a significant tightening in over the previous interim target for 2030. Of course, the EU Commission knows very well that there are multiple existing challenges, not only in the doing, but also in the communication of this renovation wave. And Mr. Timmermans, the Vice President responsible for the climate issues in the EU Commission, said the funding renovation faces a considerable investment gap. And I think that's at the core of the problem. All actors are struggling with investment gaps. It's not only industry, it's not only business, it's also, as I sometimes put it, it's companies, countries, and consumers. They're all struggling with different sets of investment gaps which have to be overcome. And of course, the Corona-related economic crisis has not been making this effort any easier. So therefore, the EU Commission does not only have to come up with sensible proposals in terms of communications, it has to come up with good ideas and a very good set of instruments to overcome these investment gaps and how to mobilize the required investment capital. And we welcome that after many years, the renovation wave has been made a core element of European climate policy, because we see there an enormous potential for local development. In Germany, the locally added value of any renovation wave is estimated at over 80%. And of course, the value chains for the products of building renovation run right across Europe. So this is a great chance to get economic growth, get climate protection, and on the other hand, strengthen the economics, the economies in Europe. It has really the potential to turn into from a simply green deal into a smart deal. And therefore, I'm very happy that today we can discuss with members of the Parliament, members of the EU Commission, and of course our Ministry for the Interior, which is responsible for the building sector in Germany, about the ways we can make this renovation wave a success. And it is not a lot of time, as I already said. We need to have short-term success there to meet the targets, especially for 2030. So the most important thing probably is to win over the people of Europe to this renovation wave. And especially the homeowners are those who very often struggle a lot with the major investments needed to make a building energy efficient. But I think it can be done, but it needs a lot of help and it needs the right regulatory framework. So energy efficiency of building is often described as the lowest hanging fruit in climate policy, but obviously it's true from a technological angle, but from an investment angle, obviously the fruit is hanging extremely high. So otherwise it's not explainable that we've not picked it yet. And therefore, I'm very glad to have this good set of experts in this panel today to discuss over the best ways to overcome this slow and sluggish renovation activity in Europe and how we can make it a climate and an economic success story. So thank you for being with us, and now I'm looking forward to all the inputs and a fruitful discussion. Matthew.
Thank you very much, Holger. I would like to turn now to Mr. Van Steen, who is going, hopefully, to give us some cues on what Mr. Lösch just mentioned in terms of finding ways to make this plan work, both in economic and in terms of the environmental impact. Mr. Steen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I hope you can all hear me and see me, most importantly, hear me. I'm really very happy to be with you today in this roundtable discussion on something which is really very, very important for the Commission and something that has kept us, at least us in DG Energy, but actually across the Commission, very busy in the last month. And I'm very happy to be able to discuss today also with members of the European Parliament and the other people on the panel here today, because it is something which we really, really need to make work. As you know, buildings are now quite high on our political agenda, and I think we have a situation where which is different from what been previously. We're now looking at it in a much more holistic way. This is not just about improving energy performance or to get energy savings out of our buildings. It's also about health. It's about dealing with energy poverty. It's about affordable housing and sustainable.
Mr. Van Steen, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but if you could turn off the live stream in the background, then we wouldn't have an echo. I'm afraid some of us have an echo there.
You have an echo. Voila. I will perhaps try and do this. Does that help?
Thank you very much.
It's better now?
Yes, that's better, yep.
Okay, very good. So what I was trying to say was that buildings these days is about a lot of different things. It's not just about energy efficiency or energy savings. It's also about health. It's about dealing with energy poverty. It's about sustainable living, sustainable construction. It's about integration of renewable energy. It's incorporating digital and smart solutions. It's about creating jobs, very, very importantly, especially in the situation in which we find ourselves right now with the COVID crisis and the economic downturn that has happened as a result of that. And why are buildings so important here? Well, it's simply because it brings multiple benefits to the economy, the society, and the environment if we will be able to improve building standards and speed up the renovation of buildings. And that's why it is so important and why the von der Leyen Commission has made this one of its absolute priorities. I think it was already mentioned by Holger, the really huge importance of buildings in our economy in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's very, very clear that if we are to meet our objective of climate neutrality by the middle of this century, and in fact, it's not an if, it's an absolute necessity, it's very clear that we need to do something seriously about energy consumption in buildings. Buildings in Europe are, of course, unique. They are diverse. They also reflect the culture and the history of the countries in which we live. And due to a well-established legislative framework for the energy performance of buildings and products, new buildings today are much more efficient than buildings that were constructed just a few years back. That's of course very good, but the problem is that there are far too few new buildings constructed, and the majority of us live in buildings that are quite old and will be standing in many, many years to come. That is why the renovation wave is absolutely essential. It aims to at least double the annual energy renovation rate of both residential and non-residential buildings by 2030. And I think Holger said it, this is a very short time span. It would mean in reality that we have to renovate at least 35 million building units by 2030. We published this in October. It has been broadly welcomed and accepted by both the European Council and the European Parliament, as well as by stakeholders and national administration. And as I said, it's really a holistic approach, much different from what we've done last. And it looks at renovation of our homes, our workplaces, our schools, hospitals, public buildings. And we need to transform these into healthier, greener, smarter, more accessible, resilient, and future-proof buildings. It's also important to mention that the renovation wave builds upon wider principles and objectives. In particular, the renovation wave is underpinned by the climate neutrality objective. It applies the circularity principles of the circular economy principle. It contributes to Europe's economic recovery. So I already mentioned that we find ourselves in a situation where building renovation really has enormous potential to help. And it protects the right of everyone to have affordable, livable, accessible, and healthy housing, while at the same time we need to safeguard, obviously, our cultural heritage. The renovation wave came out also with an action plan with concrete regulatory, financing, and enabling measures for the years to come. Let me perhaps mention a couple of the most important ones. What we think we need to do, we need to have better information, legal certainty, and incentives via, for example, more widely available energy performance certificates, promotion of building renovation passports, and digital building logbooks, alongside a phased introduction of mandatory minimum energy performance standards. That is something which we have so far shied away from, and we thought that might be a step too far, but we do feel that this is now something that we seriously need to look at, and we did announce that we will gradually introduce these. How precisely this is going to be done will, of course, be the subject of a thorough impact assessment, and that will come when we revise our energy performance of buildings directive towards the end. While opinions are split in some areas, several member states have already introduced such mandatory requirements. For example, in the Netherlands, office buildings must have at least a C-class certificate before they can be rented out. That's the kind of thing that we're looking at, and something that has actually worked well in some member states. We may come back to that in our panel discussion, but we are quite excited about this, and we think that's something that could really work well. Secondly, I think Holger also mentioned that the finance, and that's a very important part of the renovation wave, that we need to look at financing for this building renovation, which will cost, we think, around 275 billion euros every year for the EU as a whole. We need to increase the volume and impact of EU funding, but of course, even with lots of EU funding, a lot of this still needs to, or the majority of this will have to come by private investments, and we need to stimulate green loan financing, and we need to also look at the technical assistance to prepare renovation project pipelines so that it's quite clear what can and should be financed. And that's why we have, together with the Renovation Wave, we came out with a document which listed what available EU funding we have for this type of thing. It's like a guide to sometimes the difficult maze of EU funding in these areas. Other important elements of the Renovation Wave refer to the promotion of comprehensive and integrated renovation interventions for smart buildings. And this is, of course, very important, that there are a lot of technologies that can make building construction process better, both for new buildings, but also make renovations easier, faster, cheaper, and without disturbing the users of the buildings more than absolutely necessary. That is something that we will look at in many ways, including also in the Horizon Europe research program. The smartness of buildings will play a key role in our view. We need to make sure that buildings are smarter. We have already made some tools available. So, for example, the Smart Readiness Indicator, which will be an indication of how much ready buildings are to take on board new technologies to improve performance. I already mentioned renewable energy as an important element of this. There's a very good opportunity when you do renovation of building to speed up the integration of renewables. We know, of course, renewables are the energy of the future. Many ways to integrate them into building, but also into the broader use, for example, through using renewables to power district heating systems and so on. Really, really important to look at all of that. As I said, we believe that there are an enormous number of green jobs available in this business. We need, however, to have better skills for the people who work in building renovation, and that's why we have worked also very closely with the colleagues in the Commission departments that work with these type of things, and it's part now of the Commission skills agenda and the upcoming Pact for Skills. And then lastly, and that has achieved quite some attention, is the creation of a European Bauhaus. This was actually an idea that came directly from the President of the Commission, Mrs. von der Leyen. And this initiative will nurture a new European aesthetic that combines performance with inventiveness, matches sustainability with style, and could sort of bring together different trades across this area in design, architecture, construction, across Europe and even beyond Europe if necessary. And we think could actually also give a lot of additional appeal to citizens, that they would be able to see that this is not just about boring buildings, but also about exciting ways of living. We have identified a number of focus areas. We think, obviously, that is quite logical. We should begin by the worst performing buildings, but there are also other buildings that should have our full attention, especially public buildings should again act as models, and we also need to look at the social infrastructure, public and privately owned social infrastructure, public administrative buildings, for example, cultural institutions, schools, hospitals, healthcare facilities. They can really spearhead the renovation wave and serve as a role model and a reference point for what is needed here. I also mentioned already heating and cooling. I mean, obviously, heating and cooling is a critical area. A lot of the energy that goes into our buildings are used for heating. A lot of that heat currently comes from fossil fuels. That has to change. We need to have buildings that require less heating, and the heating we need needs to be provided by renewable energy as far as possible. So that's what's in the renovation wave. So there's a lot of different things that requires to be done. That, of course, is only part of our job. an essential aspect will be to ensure the proper implementation of the current legislation, for example, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, and the long-term renovation strategies which member states should be doing. Some of them are doing it, fortunately, but I also have to say a number of member states have not provided these to us within the time they should, and this is something that we are trying to remind member states that they have to come up with these, because these renovation strategies are really important. They're also really important, for example, when member states are doing their plans for recovery, because those renovation strategies can create a lot of inspiration for these plans, and we would like to see a lot of building renovation go into recovery and resilient plans that member states have to do. I think I will probably leave it there. I look very much forward to the panel discussion, where we can perhaps go into more detail on some of the elements that I have mentioned here. Thank you very much for listening so far. Over to you, Matthew. I hope in the end the sound quality was okay. Thank you.
It was excellent. Thank you very much for your very interesting remarks. And I would like to now jump into the discussion. And if I may, I'd like to start with you, Pernille Weiss. And get your reaction to what we just heard, both from Mr. Van Steen and from Holger Lösch, because as we know, these greenhouse gases that come from the building sector are quite high. They get less attention, I would say, in the general public than say the transportation sector, and the ideas about how to reduce these greenhouse gases from buildings seem to be less prominent in the media coverage, I would say, possibly because it's a less sexy issue. And yet we see the Commission setting a very, very high target here, reducing by 60% by 2030, just 10 years from now. As we just heard, that would cost 235 billion euros a year. Is this really realistic in your view? I'm sorry, I think you have to unmute, please, Pernille. Yep.
Now you can hear me, right?
There you are. Yes, we can hear you now. Oh, you can hear you.
Okay, that's cool. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Let me start there. Being the carpenter's daughter, the carpenter who was the son of a carpenter, who was a son of a carpenter, and also having a mother who was a nurse, who had a mother who was a nurse. It's a really big pleasure to be here today talking about, you could say, how to make a renovation wave sexy, because that is a part of the equation that we need to get a grab around, but also to speak up very loudly about all the benefits of really knowing and respecting and working with your home, with your house, with the building that you rent or own as a business person. Because there are so many benefits. Hans van Steen has listed them all up, that I will not reiterate them, of course. So I will only address, if I can, the question that you raised to me, whether it is realistic to reach the 2030 targets for renovation wave, and also in the longer term to make the renovation wave be that centerpiece of the European Green Deal. And to be honest, I really do think that we will succeed. And but what it takes is that we really get our citizens and SMEs on board to make the big push, because we need projects to be started. We need the energy and curiosity to be sparked to assess the different types of buildings that are around in Europe, to really find out what is possible, what is needed, what are the benefits, not only for energy consumption and the reduction of carbon, but also all the social and health benefits linked to that. And for that to happen, we must start with the citizens and the SMEs and provide for them one of the tools that colleagues and me put into an opinion report that we launched this fall on how to maximize the energy efficiency in the building stock, and where we also see that the Commission really took that report on board. One of the ideas that we have is the one-stop shops, kind of evidence-based help offices that you can address in your home country to find out how to get the system and the process around your building, whether it is going to be a deep stage or a staged renovation, but also to get the help to find out how to finance, because as also Hans van Steen has said, it will both be public money, and we are pushing the boundaries as much as possible. I could, as the carpenter's daughter, wish for even more on that. But also, we must work with the incentives to have private investments into the equation for maximum renovation wave movements. If we manage to do so, to really spark the sexiness, you could say, of the renovation wave and the love again to architecture and our buildings, whether it is our homes or where we work, then I really think that the renovation wave can help us to reach our climate goals. Then also, maybe that could be a part of the toolbox of how to create this sexiness urge to the renovation wave is the social aspects that also Mr. van Steen said. And it was by purpose that I mentioned that my grandmother and mother and a lot of other females in my family of carpenters are actually nurses, because there are so many hidden benefits from understanding how the physical environment actually works on us as human beings, on our social interactions, on our security. I mean, let's face it, coronavirus have learned us, both in good and bad ways, that it's very, very important that our homes, and especially where we work, that the physical environment does not create situations where we cross-contaminate each other when trafficking, doing our job. And architecture and the art of engineers really have a lot of solutions if asked. I know that because I've had a consultancy company for 13 years, but also I've worked with a lot of engineers throughout Europe. And what I've learned through that, also framed from my now 1.5 years as a European politician, is that we as politicians, we need to understand the importance of our role as facilitators now, because the renovation wave and the energy efficiency that can be done in our physical environment, do not need the wheel to be invented, because we already know what to do. What we need is actually to facilitate that the right people finds each other and finds the finance and finds the framework of project processes that makes things actually happen, so that people, that families, as citizens can see, okay, we do create more jobs, we do create more safe and more environment-friendly homes, and we actually can see on our energy bill that our living costs are being cut because of a reduction in energy consumption, and also that we can see on our bill that the amount of renewables that goes into our heating and cooling system of our homes is actually increasing. So yes, to your question, it is doable, but we also need to get out and get the job done tomorrow. To be honest, you said in 10 years. I mean, we have New Year's Eve in less than a month. We only have 9 years left. So I also look very much forward to all the political work in front of us, where we can work with both the incentives, with the standards that also Hans van Steen mentioned, to help the member states and the different typologies of physical environment and buildings around in Europe to get the help they need, tools, knowledge, evidence, best practice. Maybe also that's one of the ideas that I would like to just bring into this conversation, and then I will give the floor back, because I don't know how much speaking time I have, so maybe you can just stop me if I have to stop now. But I do have one idea that I would like to put in here, and that is that we do not yet have the EU climate law. I really, really look forward for us to have that hopefully in the spring. And one of the valuable sentences that has not been spoken that much about is that from the EPP side, we suggested that we in the future will have these sector-specific climate partnerships, not picking the winners, but actually creating partnerships between businesses, researchers, politicians, and in the framework of the renovation wave, the citizens, where we can develop this culture of talking with each other about what are our successes, what are the obstacles, how do we work forward, what do we still need to get fixed in the different parts of the renovation equation. Let it be techniques, let it be smart grid solutions, it might be finance, etc., etc. So this sector-specific climate partnerships, maybe that could be also a part of the Bauhaus organization design, that we also always remember to see the perspective of the export potential, that if we can make the renovation wave as this living showroom of how to do it, that also intrigues the rest of the world to come to EU for guidance, for technologies, for best practices. That could really make a difference, I hope. So thank you for giving me the floor. I hope that I have talked enough for now. I don't have the sense of that in this remote format. To be honest, I hate it. But let's see. I be quiet now and listen, and hopefully you can use what I've said.
Thank you very much, Pernille. It was very interesting, and we'll come back to you shortly. But I would like to go now to Lothar Fein-Krestas. Lothar, as you heard from Pernille, it's absolutely essential that we get the citizens involved in this process, that they embrace these goals. I think some people, though, would look at these plans and say, well, wait a minute, it looks like all of the onus here is on the citizens, and they're expected to manage this. This is something where we see in other areas much more involvement of the state already, of national governments, of the EU getting involved. If you look, for example, the way the German government is subsidizing electric cars, for example, very forcefully now, do you think it's realistic that we're going to be able to reach these goals by 2030? And what do you think national governments in particular, like yours, can be doing more to move this along and to make this renovation wave sexy, as Pernille has said?
On my mic also, here I am. Well, yes, first of all, I'm impressed how much this meeting is dominated by carpenters and their families today. That's nice. Yes, well, that's a huge challenge we have to take, and we have to take it on. but it's not a really new challenge actually, and we are already in the middle of doing so. There is a climate plan nationally in Germany, and that's very much addressing also the building sector, and there is a huge subsidy program already in existence, and it's going to be extended by the beginning of next year. So that's not entirely new. What's actually new is stepping up the goals, and the process of negotiating that is underway. I understand that there is pretty much, or it's pretty foreseeable, that the goal for 2030 is going to be increased to 55% overall over all the sectors. And now then after that, it's going to be broken down to the different member states and sectors. Looking at our sector, building sector, the thing we are talking about today, in our national environment, the building sector is going with the source principle, responsible for 14% of the CO2 emission. But in talking about this in a more broader perspective, we refer to 30 to 40% connected with the building sector, since the issues of heating, which basically go to the energy sector, and the issues of building products, which go to the industry sector, and so on and so forth, are in connection are in connection with the building sector, and the building sector basically is deciding how much energy is needed for heating, or how much building products, or which building products are used for construction. So the issue is even more complicated if you decide for a different way of constructing buildings that obviously has to be paid out of the building sector. Or if you decide for a more sensible way of heating buildings, or electrifying buildings and things like that, it's going to be paid out of the building sector and paid out of the rents of people. And as you were asking, it's very important to keep in mind, or to not overburden both the landlords, or those who we definitely need to build further housing, or those who are renting or are renting an apartment and are short of money for doing so. Obviously somebody has to fill the gap, as Mr. Lösch was already pointing out, to keep building affordable, keep buildings affordable. And there are just 10 years to reach these goals. We roughly calculated what that means for our building stock. That basically means we have to fundamentally renovate every second building around the country. And there is another limit to that, which is basically the capacity of the building industry. And right now in Germany, we are in the good shape of having a well running building sector, and in order to renovate half of the buildings in Germany within the next 10 years, we would basically have to step up to 4% of renovation per year, coming from 1% these days. And so we feel like the industry right now is not fully prepared to do so. How can we target this? We have to send very clear messages that the demand is going to stay there in the mid and long term. That's why our subsidy program is beyond the next 2 or 3 years. It's going to stay there for the next 3 years to make sure that the industry feels they can step up their capacities. And that's another important part of it, because if you just push subsidies into the market and there is no supply, not enough supply, it's going to just skyrocket prices. Bottom line is, yes, there's a huge target and we have to take up the challenge.
Turn to you, Holger Lösch. Renovating every second building in Germany, that's a lot of buildings. It sounds like I should give up journalism and become a carpenter. Like the other should. Is that something you think is really feasible in terms of the available finance right now? And what are you looking for from the government and from the EU in this space? What would you like to see happen on this front?
Well, first of all, we have to see we're not only talking about private owners. We're talking about commercial buildings, and we are talking about public buildings, which goes right into the pockets of the, or is emptying right the pockets of the public sector as well. So we have to look at 3 very different sectors which have to come up with innovation initiatives. And of course, they all need different sets of incentivizing them to do things. So sometimes I think what Pernille said, the facilitator image is the most important thing. Things are just too difficult today. So if you, most of the people talking now about the private owners, the building a house, buying a house is a once in a lifetime decision. Most of the people. Well, we have people who have built like 10, 20 houses all over the globe, but this is a very small minority. So most of the people, they do this once in a lifetime. And then a huge innovation effort is another once in a lifetime challenge. So we have to make sure that, first of all the processes of planning this, getting a permit, getting incentives, all of this has to be done easy. This has been in the past sometimes a very troublesome experience for people. So you ask one carpenter to stick with the carpenter, which is obviously the main theme of this discussion now. So asking one carpenter, he's going to tell you a totally different story than the other one. The one say, okay, do it like this. The other one says, oh, please don't do it like this. This is going to cost you a fortune. So people are insecure. And if you are insecure, you're not going to invest. So we need the right incentives in place, and we've learned that tax rebates are very often a good incentive. Some other people would like more of a direct incentive, a direct subsidy. So this differs, but the other thing is get processes, easy processes, because if it's too difficult and you need like 10 experts to get your roof done, this will deter people from doing what has to be done. Another thing is we need the workforce. And workforce are only building up if there is a reliable long-term demand visible. If it's like, okay, we do this for 1 year, and perhaps we do it different after that. So this is not going to work. We have to give reliability and safety to companies who are building up workforces. Because today, to go to the carpenter again, it might take months to get a carpenter even to respond to the phone if you ask him to do something in your house, because they're just overloaded with orders and don't have the capacity to take up any more orders. So these are just a few things we really have to look at. But basically, people have to be sure this is not going to ruin them. This is a benefit for themselves, their inheritance, and the house. And it has to be easy, and it has to be, and we have to do it quick, of course. We can't wait for years. to build up a workforce which can do every second building in the house, in the country.
And I can confirm that it is very difficult, in Berlin at least, to find a carpenter, much less a good carpenter. But I would like to return to you, Hans von Steen, and get your reaction to some of the things that you've heard here. And one of the things that struck me about this very ambitious target, which I think everyone agrees is worth pursuing, but given the short time period, the 9 years, as Pernille says, and the cost, as you said, 275 billion euros a year. Do you think that the EU could run into a credibility issue by setting such an ambitious target without a clear path as to how it's going to be reached? If we just take one example, as Holger Lösch just mentioned, with finding enough workers to do that. Where are they going to come from? Where are not just the carpenters, but all of the other craftsmen and women going to come from that would need to renovate these buildings?
It's a very good point, I think, and I think many very valid points were made by the other speakers. But I think this one is actually quite a critical part of this whole strategy. If we are unable to make ends meet in terms of having skilled people to also carry out these renovations, it's just not going to work. I'll give you one example, which is actually a personal example. A few years back, I had a new roof put on my house, and I did it correctly. It's a nice energy efficient roof, and it was very good. But I thought, maybe I can also stick some solar panels on it. And I had some guys out to look at it, and they said, no, it's not really good. There are some trees, there will be too much shade. The orientation is not quite good. So we would really not recommend that. And I sort of accepted, okay, that's how it is. But then last year, my neighbor had exactly the same operation, and he had some solar panels put on. And I just talked to him a few weeks ago, and he said they're producing wonderfully, apart from the fact that they have or even if they have exactly the same orientation and the same trees and all the rest. So obviously there are issues there where skills are required in order to give people the right kind of advice, and that's a real shame. To your question about whether we could have a credibility crisis, I think we would have a credibility crisis if we just keep, shall we say, putting targets, but without also saying how these targets are going to be met. So we have now put into the world the 55% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030 as the right level of emission reductions in order to be on the track towards climate neutrality. This is a very solid impact assessment from the Commission that clearly demonstrates that. But in fact, that impact assessment also shows that both in terms of the share of renewable energy and also energy efficiency has to be stepped up. We have in legislation today, we have for energy efficiency a target of 32.5% by 2030, improvement compared to 1990. But that impact assessment shows that that will have to be significantly increased, up to at least 37% for final energy, or maybe more than 40% when it comes to primary energy. And that is, in fact, very significant. And if we are not sort of putting in place the measures that can help us achieve that, I think that would be a credibility problem. And that's why we need to look at all the different elements that are required. And we will do that, for example, now also reviewing key pieces of legislation by already June next year, which is a very, very fast track. And my colleagues and in fact myself as well are really working full speed in order to meet that deadline. And later next year, so towards the end of the year, we will also come with a review of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. And these pieces of legislation, for example, the Renewable Energy Directive, but also things like ETS and the effort sharing mechanisms under the ETS are really important to get right in order to meet this. So for that, we rely on all the policymakers to help us when we come forward with legislation to put in the right framework necessary. And for example, the minimum performance standards that I mentioned in my first intervention might be one thing that is necessary in order to be credible, and not just say that we need higher and higher targets, but without sort of giving some indications about how these targets can actually be met. And I think that is really important, not just to increase our ambitions without also giving clear indications about how we're going to meet it. And that's especially important because when we looked at the member states for 2030 that came in through the National Energy and Climate Plans, which is part of the current framework, we noticed that they do not actually add up to the right level. There's a gap as far as energy efficiency is concerned of between 2 and 3 percentage points. So even with the current level of ambition, let alone the 55% greenhouse gas emission reductions or a higher energy efficiency target, even with the current level of ambition, we are already in trouble unless we do something. And that's why policy needs to follow, finance needs to follow. And in fact, that is exactly why the renovation wave is trying to address all these things.
Thank you very much, Hans van Steen. Pernille, I'd like to come back to you on this because as a parliamentarian, as a member of the European Parliament, you were very much in the thick of these debates, and the Parliament had its own view on the renovation wave strategy and what the Commission should be doing. Do you think that the communication has been effective? Do you see any room for improvement? And if so, what would you really like to see there?
That's a good question. Thank you for that, because when you are in the middle of something that you are really personally excited about, and I have a history from building, as I mentioned, then you tend to think that the rest of the world shares that interest, but they do not. And we really have to find out also on the Parliament side, and that is something that I work a lot with in the work I do in SME Europe, but also cross-border between ITRA and ENVI, where the committees where I have a seat, and try to find out who are my colleagues in the House that can act like kind of ambassadors for renovation wave, and to remind our other colleagues that are maybe more into offshore windmills, that is big projects that you can fall in love with because they are so special. Renovation of the existing building is, again, not yet that sexy. So I really think that we need to push our creativeness in how to make this network of colleagues that are really up fire on renovation wave, to remind us every single time it is possible to put on the topic of energy efficiency. I will actually link to that because also, as Hans van Steen said, that we are lagging behind on energy efficiency in the national member states. And being a Dane myself, I must acknowledge that although I'm sitting here in Brussels, I can point my finger to the national state levels, to those who do not perform yet to the targets. But I also have to work more practical on that with my own party and also with the parliament back home in Denmark, to say to the Prime Minister, please step up on energy efficiency, because we know what to do, we know what to win, and there is indeed a lot to win. If I can be allowed to just put in a short comment to something very valuable or said in the debate just now here this afternoon on the workforce issue. Not to make a joke about that, I'm also the mother of a coming carpenter. But that said, I think we also need, and maybe we can talk about that later on, is how to get the best of a generation of young people to work in buildings, maybe as carpenters, maybe as architects, maybe as engineers. And addressing the question and the case story from you, Hans, with your roof, and those who said to you that it wouldn't work, it wouldn't help, and then knowing that a neighbor got another advice, says a lot about skills, but also about maybe we should be careful not to put too much academia to the front staff in the renovation wave. We will have also to facilitate and assist them in the best tools to actually give the evidence based advices to give to citizens. Because if you were not the Hans van Steen who know a lot on this topic, you would then be disappointed and maybe also ignorant to, okay, what can actually happen from engaging in energy efficiency with my private home, because one carpenter says this and another one says that. What can we actually depend upon? So I think we should work with the front personnel, give them the tools that they need to give the citizens the facts that they need to start up their private projects. There's a lot of tools that we need to address, but I also think we really must be careful not to put too much academia in the front personnel. There are backstage staff and front stage staff, and the front stage staff is those who meet the citizens in their daily life, how to organize on the renovation projects.
Thank you very much, Pernille. And I would like to remind our audience to feel free to ask questions should you have any. Again, you can do that via the chat function on both YouTube and LinkedIn. Lothar, I would like to come back to you on this question of the communication, because it really is an important document from the Commission, and there's always a lot of discussion and interplay between the Council and the Commission on issues such as this. How has this been received so far within the Council in your view? We need you to unmute, please, Lothar.
It's totally understood that the ambitions need to step up on the 2030 goal by Germany, and but it's as I pointed out, it's going to be a very, very ambitious goal to actually reach, to be honest, we are just discussing how to get there, and whether we are actually going to be able to fulfill that in the for the building sector, and as I was pointing out, also in connection with the other sectors. I think it's too simple to just look at the building sector, because the building sector is massively causing or supporting or enabling the reaching the goals in the other sectors, there is this this saying, efficiency first. So basically insulating buildings, and definitely there's a lot of need for that, but at a certain point it's getting unreasonable. And then we are also connected with the energy sector again. How can we generate more renewable energy at the houses, like solar panels and things? And also, how can we fill in the gap, the still needed amount of energy for basically cooling and heating the houses? And there is lots and lots of fine-tuning needed, and then lots of communication needed to the customers, needed to the industry, So I kind of like the discussion here about the staff we actually need. And also the remark of Mrs. Weiss that we should not only focus on the high-end technologies, because the high-end technologies might, in cases, end up being not working. And I could give you tons of examples where the design was made you expect certain figures and numbers, and it turned out nobody was able to build it that way, and nobody was able to run it that way. And at least beyond the point when this thing is constructed, somebody who is a totally layman is living in that house and basically is just running that thing so it's warm enough. And that's contradicting the goal of CO2 emission. That's more tricky. So communication goes beyond just explaining people we need to renovate buildings. We also need to know how to run buildings. I always say if you buy a kitchen tool, there is a manual how to run the kitchen tool, but there's no manual how to run your building, and the building is way more complex. So there is a real quality issue we have to keep in mind.
Lothar, I would like to stick with this technology point with you, Holger, because what Lothar was just saying about technologies not working the way they had been envisioned reminded me a little bit of the energy transformation in Germany, the Energiewende, as it's called, and all of the aspirations people had some years ago that, yes, this is going to cost a lot of money, but we're going to be able to market this approach to the rest of the world. We're going to invent technologies here that everybody is going to embrace. It didn't turn out that way. How important do you think the technology piece is here when we're talking about the renovation wave? And is there a danger that, as Lothar just indicated, there might be too much focus on high-tech technology that turns out not to work instead of maybe more practical solutions?
Well, fortunately, in the building sector, we are not overly loaded with high-tech approaches. So most of the technologies we know are not high-tech. They are well known and they are well understood. But we need definitely more technological innovation. I would guess that the smart home approach is going to be a bit difficult. This has been tried for like 20 years, and customers are not really deeply into this. But for example, if you look at heat pumps are the most probable alternative to fossil heating. But now I go for my house again. It's 120 years old, and I have 120 years old wooden panel floors. That's a problem to heat it with a heat pump because you need underfloor heating, and I'm not gonna rip out my 120-year-old wood panels. So we need new heat pumps, developments in heat pumps, which can work with the normal, how do you call them? Radiators, the radiators we use today. So that's just one example. But on the other hand, we have to look at new serial, industrial, lightweight ways of building in new buildings or topping up existing buildings, which is a very cheap way of creating new space for housing and doing this in an efficient way. But we have to sort out a few interests of conflict in terms of circularity of construction materials. This very often collides with environmental regulation, which is in place in terms of how much content of any substances may be in secondary construction materials. So we have to sort out some of these things. But if we understand the Green Deal, as the Commission has always put it, as a global or a European growth strategy, then we of course have to look that we develop technologies in terms of energy efficient buildings and new forms of building to make them a success on global markets. And we know that most parts of the world are growing by a much larger rate than Europe does, and therefore the need for new housing, for efficient housing, for, as Pernille put it, healthy housing, safe housing, is going to happen around us on other continents, and therefore it's part of this growth equation of the Green Deal that we develop technologies here, we show that they work here, and then make a technology leadership out of this. And one last word to the Bauhaus. I think that's a good idea because Bauhaus is a symbol, a global symbol for what always happens with architecture. Architecture very often reflects changes in the minds of societies, changes in the way people want to live, changes in the way societies develop. And therefore, it's a very good symbol because it's something very well known around the globe. This has not only happened in Germany, this has happened in Israel and other parts of the world. So I think this is the kind of narrative we have to fill now, because this can bring the fire Pernille alluded to, the fire and the passion to look at new ways of living and with that accomplishing the climate targets.
Thank you, Holger, and that's a very good segue into a question that we received from someone in the audience, which is directed at you, Hans van Steen, which is, today we try hard to make architecture work in the operation phase of buildings using technical equipment such as building automation. Therefore, it would be helpful if you could make the new Bauhaus a form follows function approach. Will you be able to ensure that?
We would certainly attempt to do that. I think we're just starting now to figure out how that project is going to be rolled out. We have, shall we say, a multidisciplinary team set up within the Commission with many different parts of the Commission taking part, and all aspects of the Bauhaus really need to be looked at, including everything to do with smart automatization and so on. These are really important elements. The thing is, of course, with the Bauhaus, that is, at least in its pure form, looking at new buildings, and we do need a lot of renovation as well. And of course, we cannot. There are many buildings that cannot be, shall we say, Bauhaus compatible. And here I'm talking about a lot of the social housing which was built maybe some 30 or 40 years ago. Very poor energy efficiency standards. It's across Europe, in certain parts of Europe more than others, but across Europe you will find these things. And these buildings are very similar. And that's why I think one thing, and that was touched upon also by the previous speakers, we need to look at how we can industrialize the renovation process, because it is really a very much a standardized process to bring these buildings up to standard. This requires some technology, but mostly existing technology. So it's not so much about making very fancy things at work here. It is about simply bringing buildings up to a energy efficiency standard, whereby you can say, first of all, you improve the comfort of the people who live in these houses, because we shouldn't forget either that there are still a lot of people across Europe who claim that, and I think with good reason, say that they are unable to heat their homes in winter up to the level they would want. That is simply not acceptable at this point in time. I think that's something that we need to look at. And then just a word maybe on the, I mean, it sounds like a lot of money when we talk about these 275 billion euros a year for the renovation. Yes, it is a lot, but it is also money that is invested and that will come back. in the shape of, so we say, energy saved, reducing our import bill. A lot of the energy which is used, for example, for heating is still imported. There's a really overall true upfront investment, but it's money that will come back in relatively short period of time. A lot of these things have short payback times, and that's why it's the right thing to do. And it's clearly among all the options that we have, for example, to kickstart the economy after the COVID crisis. Building renovation is one of the most promising. It is the one where we can tick all the boxes, create jobs, get the economy going, have effects at local level, positive effects at local level. It is really something that we hope member states should embrace when they do their plans. We have, from the Commission side, created a module, a so-called flagship, that we have provided to member states as inspiration for how to do their plans. We have already seen some of the plans that have been submitted. It's looking okay, but there's still scope for more. And with all the money which is available, we hope that, of course, the budget will be finally approved very shortly, but that's something which is a little bit outside our control. But once the budget is available, we have a lot of money, because it is decided that almost a third of this has to be going into sort of climate-friendly and climate-proofing investments, and that's where energy efficiency, renovation of buildings also come in. Let me leave it there. Maybe it wasn't a complete answer to the question, but I think the point is there. On Bauhaus, it should be a lot of things, including these things about smartness of buildings as well.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think one of the problems with the Bauhaus idea, some of the critics say, is that it's more of a slogan at this point than something that's really been fleshed out. There's not a lot of meat on the bone, and hopefully that will happen in the coming months, as you say, after the budget goes through, which hopefully will happen in the coming days or weeks. But I did want to return to your point about the modules that you've created, Hans van Steen, for the various, countries and how they're approaching this. Do you see a lot of regional disparities in countries' ability to embrace this plan? And if so, how do you see that division? Is it an east-west divide, a north-south divide? How would you describe it?
I mean, it's clear that there are different traditions in Europe. There are also very different starting points in parts of Europe. So I wouldn't call it divides, because I think all member states have really a very good potential here. But it's also clear that there are some more than others. I mean, I'm not going to name any particular member states, but some of the newer member states of the EU have a really, really good potential for this, and I think that would be really good if we could sort of reach that potential. Also with the recovery money that we now have. After all, it's about 550 billion out of the budget which is available for that, so that can already bring us quite a long way.
Thank you for that. I would like to come back to you, Pernille, if I may. We're almost out of time, but one of the issues here, Hans mentioned the financing question again, and one of the ideas that's been floating around here has been some kind of emissions trading scheme in this space. How has that been received in the European Parliament? What do you think of it? What do your colleagues in the European Parliament think of integrating some kind of emissions trading program into this?
Well, that's actually one of the topics where I learned that it's really needed for us as politicians who are intrigued and very much would like to push the renovation wave, to acknowledge that not many of our colleagues actually understand for what is the ETS the right tool. Because the essence of learning on ETS and the building stock is, to be very simple, that you don't need the ETS if we do what we already know we can do with the technologies that we know of and the economy, the finance that we just actually need to facilitate in the right direction, then if we still have the ETS as a possibility, that would actually risk the renovation wave to get smaller, to not have the intensity and to deliver on both decarbonizing targets, of course, but also the overall energy efficiency targets, as well as also the very many social and health-related benefits. But a lot of my colleagues, they don't know, because you need to know a little bit more specific to understand the logic. As also I'm not skilled and I'm not that much into transport energy, to be honest. I'm more into buildings because of my history, of course. So I think we really need to step up also to create these ripples of knowledge and information to the rest of the parliaments and also our local colleagues on national levels on what is actually the right elements of an optimum of equation to a given typology. And that is where the renovation wave and also the ideas of building passports, one-stop shops, evidence-based approach, best practices, and maybe also the experience that they have harvested for a couple of years now in France, where they have a kind of a political figure and kind of a renovation energy efficiency ombudsman who can push for solutions on current challenges in different areas within energy efficiency and especially within building renovations. I think we must still continue to be curious to learn what works on local levels, both with the citizens, but also, of course, and that is maybe what I would like to say as a wrap up, really engage in to have the SMEs on board, because that is the one with the mobile phone in their Kansas pants that Hans calls, or I call when I need something done in my home. I call a carpenter and tell that person what I would like to have done, but I don't maybe address it as a project of energy efficiency and how to decarbonize. I want something else to work better in my home or in where I have my business. And that's also what I would like to address as a question that I would work with around the Bauhaus. I like the talk you had before on form follows function. That makes very much sense. But, and then we go back to the initial question, how can we make energy efficiency and the renovation wave the most sexiest piece of work to do in collaboration between European politicians and institutions and local level, national governments? That is actually also to understand that from working with the form, with the culture, that is where we find new solutions for functions that we need to really get the sexiness to be increased, if you excuse that metaphorical language. But I think we must also be careful not to take all the sparkle and all the bits and pieces that really makes us love our home, love the renovation processes as they unfold. It might be in where we have our work, or it might be where we rent our home. It doesn't matter. In the curiosity around form, we get to know actually how much nerve and blood and essence and importance and sexiness do we really have in the building stock. Thank you so much for inviting me. I can see that we are now closing down. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am afraid we are running out of time. I would, though, like to hear from Lothar one last time, and in particular, Lothar, your views on the emissions trading scheme as a representative of the German government. What has been the response there, and any other closing thoughts you may have on what you've heard?
Well, thank you for that opportunity. In our setting, since we have a pretty strict cost efficiency target out of our legal system, we can't require people to do something to their buildings which doesn't pay back, at least in the midterm. And so there's a restriction to the requirements we can put on renovating the building stock. And so this CO2 pricing system, in the context of, at least for the last few months, prices of energy going down, is, I think, something at least to look at. There's a economic decision to do an investment for buildings. As everybody else here pointed out, there needs to be a perspective beyond that, which is frequently referred here to the sexiness. And I totally understand that we are competing with investment into some fancy car, which nobody is questioning in terms of economic feasibility. But in terms of renovating or making the building energy efficient, everybody is asking for a return on investment. So there is a need for influencing at least that mindset. And therefore, I think the approach of Bauhaus, that's at least what I understand there, is to break the limits of just this economic view at things, and to look at buildings as something which is comfortable, which is aesthetic, which is desirable. But still, you were asking about the CO2 emission pricing. There is a framework of tools we have to balance, one of which definitely is CO2 emission pricing. The other is subsidies. And then we have to make sure that these things stay affordable for the owners who sometimes are private house owners, and on the other hand are companies who have a totally different mindset in thinking about these things. And last of all, as Mr. Lösch at some point underlined, we need to think about the processes. I was in my previous comment very critical about to technically do buildings. I have a different, totally different opinion about the process, how to do buildings, how to do planning, how to build houses or buildings, or how to renovate buildings. There's lots and lots of room of progress with building information modeling and things like that, or things like digital building permits, and also a digital way of providing subsidies. I don't want to leave the impression that we are the showbreakers of innovation here. By no means. But one has to really think of about who is addressed with which step.
Thank you very much, Lothar. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. I think as anybody who followed this discussion today will recognize, it's a very complex undertaking that Europe is doing right now, and it's only going to get more complex. I hope this discussion helped you understand it somewhat better. It certainly helped me. Thank you very much to Holger Lösch for having us today, and I wish you all well. Goodbye.